Hi guys, I'm back with video 8 of my free online tailoring course. I hope you're well. Now this video we're actually going to use the sewing machine, we're going to use needles, threads, and we're going to start constructing our garment. In this video I'm going to show you how to construct your dart in the front of your jacket. Now you might think making a dart is pretty simple, but I'm going to show you a technique that will provide you with a really professional finished dart. We're also going to put the welt pocket in the chest, probably on the left hand side of our jacket. So without further ado, we'll make a start. Don't forget to subscribe to me so you don't miss any of my other videos. Alright, we're ready to actually do some sewing. The first thing we're going to do is sew the dart on our front jacket panel. If you've followed me and you've drafted your own pattern, then you're going to end up with a displaced dart like this. So the dart finishes at the pocket line, and obviously when the dart is sewn it will bring our side seams into the right alignment. If you're using a commercial pattern, you may have a double-ended dart, so 2 points, or fisheye dart, or you may have a dart that runs all the way full length to the bottom of the jacket. Whichever you're going to use, what I'm going to show you is exactly the same. So to sew a dart, obviously we fold our cloth right sides together, align the dart, make sure everything lines up nicely along the centre line of the dart, and pin it or baste it into place, and then we're going to sew from, in this case, the bottom of the dart up to the point. If it was a fisheye dart, start in the centre, go to one point, centre to the other point. If it was a full length dart, start at the bottom, up to the point. Make sure you leave a nice long length of thread when you've finished. We don't backstitch at the top of the dart because you end up with a nasty little bobble at the top of the dart, and we literally tie off a couple of knots on the thread at the top and then press the dart flat along its centre line, and then we would flip it back over. On the wrong side you have your dart, and we would press the dart towards the side seam like so. Now there's a couple of issues with darts, which is what I'm going to address now. When we sew a dart and press it over, we end up with 3 layers of fabric on one side of the finished dart. You might not think it's much of a problem, but I'll give you an example. So here I have 2 identical pieces of cloth, some not sort of medium weight really wool, and on both pieces I've sewn same length dart, same width dart. On this one you can see an arrow pointing to the left, because when we flip it over you'll see the finished dart has been pressed as we would normally do over. But you might notice there's a bit of a dark line running along here. Because you've got the extra fabric on one side, so 3 layers of fabric here, you end up quite often with a bit of a step in the dart, so the cloth isn't flush all the way along, and you'll feel it with your finger. And if we look at it close up, you'll see. The dart on this side, like I say, it's identical, same width. You'll notice is a lot smoother. There's no real ridge. Now this was pressed properly. It was pressed, and I used a clapper to make sure that it was pressed as flush as I could get it. This dart, you'll see just looking at it, it's a lot smoother. And then when we look at it up close, you can see that both sides are flat. And this gives a really, really nice finish, especially on the front of a jacket, because everybody sees the front of a jacket. So how did I do this? Well, I did it the way you shouldn't do it. And instead of pressing the dart over, I took my scissors and I slashed along the length of the dart almost to the top point, not quite. And then I pressed it open. So we end up with two identical pieces of fabric on either side of the dart stitching line, which gives us that nice flush finish to the outside. Don't do it this way. Okay, there's two reasons. Firstly, you're relying on your stitching. If for any reason you didn't finish the top of your dart properly, or your knot wasn't tied correctly and this comes undone, the front of your jacket is going to end up with a nasty hole in it. The other and more important problem is if you realise after you've put your darts in, you try your garment on and your dart isn't in quite the right position, well, you can't do anything about it. That dart's there for good. You can't move this dart. This one you could. Obviously you could unpick it, redraw it and move it. So how do we get this flush finish but using a dart that you could move if you had to? And that's what I'm going to show you how to do a proper balanced dart. Okay, for the demonstration I'm going to use some white cloth just to make things clearer for you. And you can see I've marked on a dart, and we're going to fold the dart along the centre line exactly as you would if you're going to sew one. And I'm going to pin it in place. Make sure that you're following exactly along this line. So flip it over and just check that you're going exactly where you need to be. I'm just going to put 2 pins in for now. Again, just flip it over and check. So there's our dart done, and now we could just sew it along. But we want to end up with the same amount of fabric on both sides of the dart. All we're going to use is another piece, and it can be the same fabric that you're using, and I quite often like to keep hold of any offcuts of salvage that I've cut off when I've been cutting the pattern out. And I'm going to use black just to make this clear. It needs to be a little bit longer than the length of your dart, so obviously if you had a full length dart you cut the long piece of fabric. If it was a fisheye or double-ended dart, cut it slightly longer. And the width of it is a little bit bigger than the finished width of the dart. So this is probably about half as wide again than your widest part of your dart. And all we're going to do is place this piece of fabric, make sure that's lined up nicely. We're going to place this piece of fabric underneath our dart, and we're going to roughly align one edge. So you've got the bulk of this extra fabric underneath the dart. So not like this, but take the dart right over to the other side of the piece of fabric. Like so. And then you could pin it in place, but it's probably a good idea just to carefully baste everything together. I'm not going exactly on the line, I'm going just next to the line because you don't want to obviously sew your basting thread as you sew your dart and then have to spend ages trying to unpick it. So just going to lightly, loosely baste it in place. So there we have the balanced fabric sewn in place along the dart line. We can go ahead now and sew this dart. Again, when you get to the top, don't backstitch, leave a length of or tail of your thread, tie a couple of knots in it, which is what I'll do now. So there we go, I've sewn along the dart line. Again, I'm using contrasting thread just to make it clear for you. We can lose our basting thread now. It's not required anymore. And all I've done is taken the legs and tied a couple of knots at the top of the dart. The next thing is just to very gently press along this folded edge of the dart, so the centre line of the dart. Don't go above it because you'll end up with creasing in your fabric. Literally just along the length of the dart. Okay, here's where the magic happens. Flip the cloth over and you can see this extra piece of fabric is sewn along the dart line, and we're going to press the fabric over itself and press it well. Make sure you pull it tight against the stitching line like so, and press it flat back on itself. So I've pressed this cloth back over itself like so. Flip the cloth back over and we're going to cut the black cloth in this instance, so the extra material we added, we're going to cut it flush to the fold along the dart line. Take your time, you don't want to snip into the actual dart itself. If anything, you can leave it slightly wider than the finished dart. As I say, go carefully. So, snip it off at the end. If it was a double-ended dart, you would literally just cut it along both ends to both points. So we've got a dart ready to be pressed open, as opposed to being pressed to one side. And we're going to press the actual cloth to one side, and we're going to press this extended piece of fabric that we added to the opposite side. So it kind of looks like our dart that we cut open, but actually you've got two layers of fabric on each side. So there we go. We've got a beautifully flush dart running from top to bottom, and obviously on the reverse side we've got the real dart pressed to one side and the two layers, in this case the black fabric, pressed to the other side. So that is how you do a balanced dart. Don't be tempted to save time and do it like this. So we'll go ahead, we'll sew the darts onto the front of our jacket using this method. Okay, so I've sewn the dart exactly the same as I've just shown you, and you probably can't see it. I'll show you a close-up picture of it so you can see how nice and flat it lies. If you flip it over, just be able to see one piece of fabric and the other piece of fabric the other side, so it's nice, flat, exactly how we want it. The next question I know you're going to be saying is, what the earth do I do with this bit? So this is where the pocket's going to be sewn in, and at the moment it's just flapping around everywhere. Couple of ways you can work this out. You could literally baste it together so the edges are butting together and just gently baste it together. That's one option, but because we're going to be sewing your pocket jets and the pocket flap and everything else in here, we really want to reinforce this area. So what I would suggest is either take a piece of pocketing long enough to start approximately 3/4 of an inch, 2 centimeters towards the front, so past the dart, so about here, all the way to the side seam. I'm just using this little piece as an example. Cut it approximately 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch wide. Put it on the back of the cloth, make sure it's all lined up, and then baste the top and along the bottom. That will obviously then hold everything together, and then when we sew the pocket parts in, you've got this reinforcing cloth underneath, which we'll need. If you've never done this before, there's another option, and that is to use woven fusible interfacing. Now when I say woven, I mean woven. If I hold it up to the camera, you can probably see it's like a very fine cotton. It's very light. You can see it's very, very thin, and it's obviously got the adhesive on one side. Cut a length, like I say, to extend forward of the dart by about 2 centimeters, about 2 centimeters wide, all the way along, and on the reverse of the fabric, fuse that, making sure the pocket lines are nicely butted together. Okay, so I've fused some of the woven fusible interfacing along this pocket opening line, and you can start to see now that everything clothwise doesn't lay flat. Obviously we've got a dart in here, so it's not going to be perfectly smooth on the table, but that's exactly what we want it to be. And remember, we've iron worked areas, we've stretched areas, we've shrunk areas, side seams we've shrunk in a little bit, so we're now starting to get a little bit of shape to the cloth. And the good thing about putting either the fusible, or if you're going to use some pocketing, it keeps everything together now while we handle it. Repeat this process for the other front panel, and then we're going to come back and we're going to make our Welt chest pocket. Okay, time for some more sewing, and we're going to be putting in the breast pocket on our left front jacket piece. So obviously make sure you've got the left front in front of you. Obviously if you've got your tailor's tacks, you know right side's up. This is the left panel. There's a couple of key things we need to know. First of all, at this point is our front notch for the sleeve, and the breast welt pocket is normally put around about that level. Okay. The first thing I like to do is square across from our notch, and we're squaring with the dart that we put in. If you don't have a dart the same as this, you can obviously use the grain line of your fabric. Just draw a very faint line across your fabric, level with the notch. So a welt pocket on the chest is normally around about 4.5 4.5 inches, 11.5 centimeters, thereabouts, and it's about an inch thick, top to bottom. This is where you can experiment, and this is why we haven't made the pattern for this already, because you can experiment and look at how you want your pocket to lie. If you've got a particularly large chest, you might want to make your pocket slightly longer and perhaps slightly deeper. Personally, I don't like a 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter thick welt pocket. I think it's too much, certainly for me. So I prefer a 3/4 of an inch, 20 millimeters, thereabouts. And conventionally, a pocket will slope upwards towards the shoulder. So it's not horizontal like we've drawn this line. If you were to put a welt pocket in horizontally, when you put the jacket on, it will look slightly wonky and it will curve obviously over the shape of the chest. You could put the pocket with a downward slope, and there's lots of very famous tailors around the world that actually do put their pockets in this way. It's a nice talking piece, and I've got one of my jackets that I wear quite often has got a downward facing welt pocket, and people love it. So it's about you now experimenting and seeing what you like the look of. You don't have to sew it yet. You can mark it all on, try it, the panel on to yourself, and look in the mirror and think, yeah, I like that, or change it. So we've drawn this horizontal line from here. The next thing we need to think about is the fact that these tailor's tacks aren't the actual stitching line. Our stitching line is going to be 1 centimeter in from this. Okay, so mark 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, just so you know that's going to be your stitching line. Like so. You want the end of your pocket to finish at least 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters away from our stitching line. So not our tailor's tacks, the stitching line. So I'm going to mark in a mark there, and the length, as I said, is around 4.5 inches or 11.5 centimeters. I generally go slightly less than that, so I'm going to go 11 centimeters and make a mark. 11 centimeters is 4 3/8 of an inch if we're working in imperial. I'm going to do an upward facing pocket, so it's going to slope upwards, and from this line I'm going to measure up 1/2 inch, 12 millimeters, like so. We can now draw from this forward point up to the point we marked. Make sure you keep everything nice and flat. Okay. We're going to extend the two ends of our pocket upwards, making sure they're parallel to either the grain line or in this case the dart. So, and as I said, I don't like mine to be an inch deep. I like it to be about 3/4 of an inch or 20 mil. Like so. So this is going to be a placement where we're going to sew in our welt pocket, and this will be actually where the fabric for the welt lies. Check it with your roll line, bearing in mind the lapel's going to come back a little bit. Just make sure you're happy that you've got enough pocket showing and it's not in the wrong position. The next thing I like to do is just baste a running thread along the bottom of where we're going to place the welt pocket, and this can be literally a very simple running stitch like so. Again, I'm using a long darner needle. And I like to go and do exactly the same at both ends of the finished pocket. Simple running stitch. And there we go, that's our pocket position marked on the front of our cloth. Go and try it on, or at least try the panel onto your chest and make sure that the pocket's exactly where you want it. Flip the lapel over like so, make sure you allow your seam allowance. You should see about that much pocket showing. The next step will be to actually make the welt, the pocket bag, and we'll sew it onto the jacket, ready for some more. Okay, so we've got the welt pocket marked out onto our jacket front. We've marked both ends with some thread, just so we know where we are, and we've marked the bottom edge again with some thread. We're not going to make a pattern as such for this. Obviously a commercial pattern would have its own pattern piece for the welt pocket. We're going to construct the pattern piece out of a piece of interfacing, and that will form the actual welt. Now, I would normally use a piece of sewing interfacing. It works very well, but if it's your first time doing this, I would recommend you don't use sewing, because certainly if you're working with pinstripes or checks or plaids, if this interfacing goes slightly awry, then you're not going to get a nice pattern match. So I would recommend you either use some of the nice woven Fusible, like I mentioned earlier on, or you can just use some normal Fusible. It's only a small piece that we need to worry about. This is just a nice lightweight Fusible. For this demonstration I'm going to use Fusible, and I'm also going to use white Fusible, just so you can see exactly what I'm doing. Obviously working with black cloth with black Fusible interfacing is going to make things difficult. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a piece of the Fusible interfacing the same width as our welt pocket, but I'm going to add 1 centimetre to the bottom of it. I'm going to mark that 1 centimetre line along. So there's the width of our welt along the top, plus 1 centimetre below. I'm also going to make sure that I mark both sides of the Fusible with this 1 centimetre line. So you've got the same line either side. We're going to place the Fusible onto our jacket front, lining up the top edge, which means this line we've drawn will lie along the bottom edge of the welt. And what's really important is the glued side, the sticky side as it were, is facing up towards you. If you accidentally do it the wrong way round, with the glued side down, you'll end up with a pocket that goes this way, not this way. Okay, so it's really important you have the sticky side, glued side up. Now I've cut the length obviously longer than the finished pocket, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark, put a pattern weight on just to keep everything in place, make sure everything's lined up. I'm going to mark the ends of the dart. Very simply just draw them in. Like so. Now I'm working with, in this case, pinstripes. I want to mark a few of the pinstripes on to the interfacing, just so we know that we're going to get our pocket lined up. We want to pattern match. If you're working with checks or plaids, obviously you can mark any horizontal lines that feature and go through your pocket. You might not have any, but if you do, mark them on. You don't need to mark every single line, just mark enough that you can line everything up. I'm just going to mark every other one. Like so. We're going to cut the interfacing along both ends as we've marked. Just check that everything is exactly as you want it and lines up perfectly. Now we can go on to the next step. So with our piece of interfacing marked out, we're going to take a piece of our cloth and we're going to place the interfacing sticky side down onto the cloth on the wrong side of the cloth. So this is the wrong side. Now you can line up obviously You might not see it on the camera, but I can see the lines that I've drawn for the pinstripe. So about there will be just right. Follow the manufacturer's instructions for your fusible interfacing. Make sure we've got everything perfect. Obviously the ends are going to be parallel to any stripe, pinstripe going down, and we're just going to fuse this in place. Remember, when you're fusing, don't iron the fusible, just apply heat to it. Okay. A really important step, and I'm sure you know this. When you apply fusible interfacing, let it cool before you pick the cloth up. If you start moving the cloth around, the fusible can stretch and the glue will set in the wrong position, so you might end up with a slightly warped shape for what you've fused. So that's pretty good. Okay. We're now going to mark around our fusible. Remember, this line is towards the bottom, and all we're going to do, we're going to draw a line. You don't really need to draw the line, but I'm doing it for the demonstration. Along the bottom, flush at the bottom edge of the interfacing, like so. At the top, we're going to draw a line parallel to the top edge, 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. Like so. And on the sides, we're going to come parallel to the sides, 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. So we've got 1 centimeter, 3/8, 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch, and we're going to cut the cloth out. Okay, so there's our welt ready for the next step. I'm going to put the welt over there, I think, just so you can see. So I've kept it the same way up. We're now going to take some pocketing, some silicea pocketing, which is what I use. Obviously, you can use cotton, whatever you like. And I've drawn a 6-inch or 15 centimeter square. The depth is generally 6 inches, 15 centimetres. The width, however, should be around about a centimetre wider than the finished edge of your welt, or 2.5 centimetres, thereabouts, an inch wider than the actual interfacing. So if you're following my instructions, your welt will be about 11 centimetres ish, so 15 centimetres will be fine. Along the top edge, however, we're going to follow the shape of our welt. In other words, this is slanting downwards. If we were parallel with the sides, we're going to do the same to the top. And we're going to measure from the right hand side half an inch, or 12.5 centimetres, 12.5 millimetres, 13 millimetres, thereabouts. I'm just going to mark like so. I'm going to join top left corner to this mark. Just for clarity on the video, because it may not look square because I've got the camera above me, I'm just going to put a little cross. This is the bottom of the cloth, this is the top, so that's the high side, the low side. And we can cut this shape out, so down the slope and around. Don't be too stressed about following the lines exactly when you're cutting out your pocket bag, because it will be trimmed after it's inserted into the jacket. This is just a guide. Okay, so back to the start. You can see our bottom edge and the slope. Let's go back to our welt. I've got 2 layers of this fabric, exactly the same. So I'll discard one, and I'll just mark the cross on this one, just so you know that's the bottom edge. And we'll just put this to one side. What we're going to do is we're going to place our welt approximately in the centre. Now, because you're lining up 2 slopes, it won't necessarily lie perfectly straight. Just get it as close as you can along the raw edge. So bottom and the top, and this is the top of our welt. And we're going to sew along this raw edge. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch or 6 millimetre seam. Now, if you want to pin it, you can. I'm just going to go and do it and bring it straight back. Okay, so I've sewn along this slanted top edge with a 1/4 inch seam, or 6 millimetres. And the first thing we're going to do, you can't see the seam obviously because I'm sewing with black cloth and black thread, but you can see that it's stitched there. The first thing we're going to do is press this seam open. Okay, so we press that seam open, flip it back over, you can see. Now we're going to use the pattern piece that we made with our interfacing. We're going to fold the welt back on it to itself, to right sides together, and we're going to use this top edge, the interfacing, as a guide. So just run it up until it's level with that top edge. And what I like to do, pop a pin in one side to hold it in place. Like so. Okay, so we've got a pin in here, just holding that in place. Before we put a pin the other side, I like to put a finger in just to lift the welt away from the actual pocket bag. So just put a finger in and we can now pin the other side. By giving that little bit of space for the welt, you will stop the pocket bag from showing through. And you can tell I can't talk and do two things at once here. Okay, so we've got a gap here, and if I hold it up to the camera you can see it's not lying flat. There's a bulge. We're going to sew along the interfacing, both sides. Make sure you backstitch at the top edge on both sides, but when you get to the bottom of the interfacing, stop, needle out and leave some thread. And I'll do that now. Okay, so I've sewn following the edge of the interfacing on both sides. And as I said, you've got this slight pocket underneath, and we're going to trim the cloth. I'm just going to draw, just so you can see, a parallel line like so. We're going to begin by trimming the corners of the welt, going as close as you can to the stitching without cutting into the stitching. We're going to come along this line and we're going to cut all the way to the stitching that we did without again cutting into it. Trim the side seams down without cutting into the pocket bag. And we've ended up with this shape. We're now going to cut the bottom edges like so. So you end up with this sort of shape. If you've got a point presser, so something like this wonderful piece of wood, you can now place this side seam, both side seams, into your presser, and press them open. If you don't have a point presser, try as best you can, even if you use your finger or anything else, just gently press them open. Like so. It will just give you a much better finish on the welt. Okay, so I've pressed both side seams open. And what we can do now is we can turn everything through to the right side. So fingers in and turn everything through. Now of course it's not going to be square, so use something to poke your corners out, or put a needle in and pull your corners out. Just take your time. Okay, remember I said about that little bulge? When we press this flat, it will make sure that none of your pocket bag will show on the edge either side. Okay, I know it's hard to see on the video, but when you come to do it, you'll see exactly what I mean. And what we're going to do is we're going to press the welt, make sure it's exactly how it should be. I like to press it from the wrong side, make sure everything's nice and flat. And if you've got a clapper, pop that on just to get a really nice crisp finish. And there is our welt ready to go with the pocket bag in place onto your jacket. Before we can sew it onto the jacket, if you remember I said when you sew from the top, leave your threads at the bottom. We need to, if we open it up, you'll see the line we drew originally. That's going to be our stitching line. That's on the interfacing. What we're going to do is open up very slightly the side seams we've just sewn, just enough to get to the line that we've marked. Now this is the only time I use one of these. No, I don't, I use them all the time. Carefully unpick your stitching without damaging the cloth. Now we're not cutting the thread, just pulling it through. Just so you can get to the line. And there we are. We can just see I'll hold it up to the camera. You can just see the stitching line, and that's ready to go onto the fabric. Okay, back to the front of our jacket panel, ready to install our welt pocket. It's a good idea at this point just to place your welt pocket into position, just to make sure that if you're pattern matching, everything lines up. If not, go away and make another welt. Don't start messing around moving things for the sake of a few minutes time and a small piece of cloth. Make one so you know that it's going to be exactly where you want it, like so. Before we actually attach the welt, we're going to add some reinforcement to the back of our jacket panel. So flip it over, and obviously we marked the bottom edge with thread trace through. I've just cut a piece of pocketing material. You can use the same cloth if you want, but I always find pocketing is quite nice. It's longer than it needs to be, that's fine. And we're going to place it midway along the lower edge and the seam line where we're going to sew the welt. Baste it into place. I'm just going to do a quick speed baste. It doesn't have to be accurately positioned as long as it's along seam line. Once again, I can't talk while I'm doing something. I wouldn't make a very good TV presenter. Don't worry about the length of it. We'll trim that all off after the welt's been installed. Okay, so there's our reinforcing strip popped in place. Some people use fusible interfacing along here. I never ever use it because it can, especially if you're working on lightweight fabrics, it can make the fabric change shape, and you'll actually notice it on the front of the cloth. So a simple piece of fabric like this will make things a lot easier. Okay, so we've got reinforcement, make sure it's nice and flat. We can remove, because we chalked on our placement line, we can remove the lower edge basting thread. And we're going to take our welt and we're going to flip it upside down. Now it's really hard to explain how to line up, obviously I've got these pinstripes, how to line them up, so I'm going to show you with a diagram. It will make things a lot easier. But you want the pinstripe running down the cloth to line up exactly with the pinstripe where it touches the stitching line. Okay, so carefully place the welt with the stitching line lined up along the bottom line that we drew. Take your time doing this to make sure everything is exactly where you want it. And we're going to baste the welt into position. I always like to baste as close as I possibly can to the stitching line. Now we're going through the welt itself, going through the front cloth of the garment, and we're also going through the reinforcement that we just placed. There's a few layers to go through. just take your time. Okay, like so. Now obviously the welt is upside down, which is exactly where we want it, because when we come to put it in position, it's going to be flipped up. Now at this point, again, you can just flip it up and just make sure any pinstripes or checks or plaids line up exactly how you expect them. If they don't, unbaste it, reposition and put it back in. So I'm happy that that's pretty good. So now we can go and sew along the line we marked on the back of our interfacing. We're going to start the first stitch right on the end of the welt. We're not going to start before the welt onto the cloth, otherwise you'll end up with a hole in your jacket. And we're going to finish exactly on the end. What I suggest is you start, sew along, and when you get to close to the other end, do it by hand. So turn the hand wheel on your machine and do one stitch at a time. If it's going to go over the end, reduce your stitch length so you can go very, very close. Back stitch at both ends. Okay, I've sewn the welt in place along the stitching line, and we can remove the basting thread that we used to secure the welt. Now you may have sewn across it like I have slightly. Just use a pair of tweezers, carefully remove the basting thread. At this point, it's a good idea to just flip your welt up into position and make sure that everything lines up if you've got a pattern, which in this case it does, so I'm happy. That's why we take the time to get everything lined up before we sew. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to cut this seam allowance. Okay, at the top, we're going to cut a chamfer on both sides, and we're going to come in about 1 centimetre. Make sure you don't cut your thread that you use to attach the welt, and obviously don't cut the cloth. Okay, like so. So we just chamfered the corners off. We can remove the thread from the ends of our welt pocket that we put in earlier on, just so they're out of the way. And we're going to take the second part of our pocket bag. Remember we cut 2 and I marked across to say that was the bottom edge. This is the high side. Remember we had a chamfer going down. And we're going to flip everything over, and this is where I've made the mistake 100 times. If we sew the pocket bag in place in this position, when it then goes through and forms the pocket bag, it will be skewed. So to place it back on as we were, bottom, high side, low side. Flip it up into place, like so, and then flip it horizontally. So it's skewing towards the lapel. And all we're going to do is going to lift up our seam allowance on the welt, slide the second part of the pocket bag so the raw edge touches the stitching line. Okay, and for this you just pop a couple of pins in just to hold this side of the pocket bag in place. And we're going to sew following the top edge of the seam allowance of the welt. So make sure we don't sew onto it, but literally alongside it, starting at the top of the chamfer that we just cut, just marking it roughly so you can see, and finishing at the other end of the chamfer. So the bottom seam allowance is this long, the top is about a centimetre-ish either end shorter. So we'll just sew along there. So we've got the welt in place, and I've just stitched the second part of the pocket bag, or the back side of the pocket bag, onto the front. Remove the pins. And this is the fun bit, or the scary bit, whichever way you want to look at it. We're going to flip the cloth over and we'll remove the basting thread that we put in place when we put our reinforcing strip. Now you're not going to see it very clearly on the camera, but we've got the longer stitching line for the bottom of the welt and then the shorter stitching line for the top pocket piece. Okay. Draw a line equal distance between the two stitching lines, like so. This is where we're going to slash through this piece of reinforcement and just the cloth. And we're going to form, I guess you call them prongs. I'm going to come back from the shortest, so that in this case the top stitching line, at least a centimetre, perhaps a little bit more, 3/8 of an inch, and again from this side. This line between the two marks we just made, we're going to cut straight, but then we're going to cut out like so to the ends where we finish our stitching, and it will be a elongated triangle with a short leg at the top and a longer leg at the bottom. I'll show you by using a diagram so you can see it clearly. So what's key now is we're going to cut, as I say, just the reinforcement and the cloth. We're not going to cut the pocketing or the seam allowance from the welt. So what I suggest is you put your fingers, open up the fabric like so as you're cutting. Make sure you cut nothing else. Now this is, like I say, the scary bit for many people. You need to cut to the very end of the stitching at each end. If you go too far, you'll end up with a hole in the front of your jacket. If you don't cut far enough, then the welt will pucker up. So really do take your time. I'm even putting my glasses on for this bit. So I've got my finger underneath, keeping everything out of the way. And there we go. So we've slashed the jacket open. Before we go any further, please rub out any chalk lines. I've got a double-sided nylon and hair brush, and just brush the chalk lines off of the cloth. The reason is that if we then press this into place, you'll have a really difficult job to get rid of the chalk lines. Make sure they're all gone. And don't forget, under the welt, where we draw our initial chalk lines, okay. Now we get to the fun bit. We're going to turn everything through the hole. So begin with your pocket bag without the welt, pull it all the way through, like so. Make sure it lies nice and flat. Give it a little tug. And we're then going to put the welt pocket bag through the hole. Just flip it over, pull everything through. And when you lay it down, make sure everything lies flat. You'll be able to feel it, and there's our welt sewn onto our jacket. sure every little chalk line's gone. And we're going to begin by pressing the, not the welt, but the lining or the pocket bag along the edge of the seam, like so. Take our pressing board and, like I say, lie everything down and make sure the pocket bags are nice and flat. What I like to do is put my hand underneath and pull the rearmost pocket bag down and hold the cloth so you get a really nice crisp finish. If you want to put a little bit of water on with your dauber, carry on. Don't worry about what the ends of the pocket, these little triangles, are doing at the moment. They're not important. We'll sort those out in a minute. Take a cloth, we'll just press like so. So that's nicely flat. And now we can put our welt, fold our welt in. Again, make sure your pocket bags are nice and flush. Give them a little tug to make sure. Once again, using a cloth, press the welt into its final position. What I like to do at this point, because I'm using a cloth, I don't like using the steam of the iron because I don't want it to be too harsh. It's a good idea to squirt a little bit of water or your aqua menthe. Just let the steam soak through the pressing cloth onto your welt. If you've got a clapper, press your clapper down. It's not about hitting it, it's about pushing the steam into the cloth. And there, you can probably see, we've got a nicely finished welt pocket in place, but we've still got a little bit more work to do. So with our welt sewn in place, the first thing we need to do is just check the little triangles that we cut when we opened up our pocket are tucked through at either end. Just push them through to the wrong side and flip the cloth over. The triangles won't sit as triangles at the end of the pocket. They'll actually point upwards because of the fact we cut, if you remember, the top stitching line is shorter than the bottom, and you can just see the little triangle of fabric will actually head towards the top of the cloth. By all means, get them in place and just give them a very quick press just to hold them where they need to be. And what I like to do is very quickly, just sew those triangles just to the reinforcement that we placed in before we sewed the welt on. It's just a case of a few stitches. We're just going through the reinforcement, not the front of the cloth. Obviously you've got the two parts of the pocket bag, the piece that's joined to the welt and the piece that's joined to the actual front of the jacket. And what we're going to do is fold our cloth tightly against the end, and we're going to sew down the pocket bag, lift our cloth up, so across the pocket bag. Now don't worry if it doesn't quite line up, just make sure you sew through both, and then finally again bringing the cloth over tight to where the end of the welt is, sew back up. And you want to get your needle as close as you possibly can without sewing into the actual front cloth. So down, along, fold it over and back up, which I'll do now. So I've sewn the pocket bag around, as you can see, right up next to the end of the welt, and we can trim the pocket bag close to the stitching. Obviously make sure you don't cut anything else. If you're worried about if you haven't got silicea and you're worried about your pocket bag fabric from fraying, then sew your first line of stitching round and then sew a second line literally a millimetre away from it all the way around, so you've got 2 rows of stitching. Just reinforce everything. When we get to the top, cut through the reinforcing strip that we put in, and that's our pocket bag finished. Flip it over, obviously you're going to test it, put your fingers in. Now we've still got the welt to deal with, it's still loose. There's a couple of ways of dealing with this. The simplest way, but to be honest not the nicest way, is to sew, using the sewing machine, a very, very small edge stitch along each edge of the welt to secure it. But of course you're going to see the stitching and it just doesn't look very nice. The way I like to do it is to actually sew it from behind, and you'll need to feel, you've got to take your time and feel the actual end of the welt, and we'll sew it through by hand from the top to the bottom with a cross stitch, or a herringbone stitch if you want to call it that. So you're sewing at right angles, you come down, right angles, come down, right angles, come down, and then you come back up to the top, so you end up with a cross stitch pattern, and you do that for both sides. Now for this task I like to use some silk finishing thread because it's very, very strong. I've mentioned it before in the videos. Begin at the top of your welt, and this is a case of using your fingers and feeling where everything is. Put your needle in, you're going through the cloth into the welt. but you don't want to come out the face side of the welt, so you don't want any stitching to show. You're literally catching the back of the welt. It's hard to see in the video. We go like so, and I'm going to come down about half a centimetre, quarter of an inch or so, and I'm going to take about the same amount of stitch. Again, just make sure nothing's visible. And we repeat all the way down to the bottom of the welt, and you can feel it with your fingers if you can't see it. Okay, when you get to the bottom, you just come back up to the top, so you're crossing your stitches over. Now the key to this, to get a really nice finish on the front, is you don't pull your threads really hard, because you'll end up puckering the fabric. Okay, so there we'll have one side of our welt sewn in beautifully, no stitching showing. It's nice and secure. Repeat that process for the other side. So sewing from the back through the layers of pocketing, just catching the welt. And to finish everything off, before we go any further, baste your pocket closed. This is really important, and I've made this mistake. Just baste along the top to keep everything in place, so that when you come to start working with the rest of the jacket, you won't accidentally catch the pocket, or it gets caught on the corner of the sewing machine, on the corner of your table, or your fingers get caught underneath it, or anything else. Baste it shut like so. Okay, and there's our pocket complete. Pocket bag in place. You've got a nice working welt pocket. So there we go, the end of the video. We've put in our balanced dart down the front, and we've put in our welt chest pocket. So go ahead, have a go, and next time we're going to move slightly lower, and we're going to put our jetted pockets in, and we'll add some pocket flaps, and I'll also discuss how to create and make patch pockets in case you want to put patch pockets on. So until next time, happy sewing, and I look forward to seeing what you've made.